Welcome back to another episode of the Divorce Differently podcast. This week, we're talking about those very early mistakes that people tend to make in divorce. Now, of course, when we start our divorce process, there's a lot of emotions. It can be really scary for a lot of people. It's one of the biggest decisions you'll make in your life. And so a lot of people find themselves reacting rather than thinking and planning. And that means that you're making decisions, in the heat of the anger, under fear, or a sense of urgency. And that could lead to missteps and mistakes that actually can be quite costly later on. So in today's episode, we're going to look at some of the most important mistakes to avoid, both from a legal perspective and from a just emotional and relationship perspective. If your intention is to try and keep your divorce under wraps and not go off piste and end up in years of litigation, the way you handle things in those early days is really going to be key. So to talk about this, I've invited Kate Stovold. Kate is a partner at the International Family Law Group in London, and she specializes in the resolution of family law matters with a special focus on financial claims arising on divorce. Now, Kate assists with the negotiation and the drafting of nuptial agreements, but she also advises parents in relation to disputes about the care of their children and the financial provision of their children. So she's got a wealth of experience. And of course, Kate, you've been involved in cases from the very inception to the end. And so you've seen yourself a lot of the things that we're going to discuss today that are unfortunately some of the common mistakes people make because, well, at that stage, you just don't know any better. Thank you for
Hi,
joining me, Kate.
Chloe. Hi, Chloe. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast, and hello to everyone that's listening. Yes, my experience as a family lawyer does mean that unfortunately I see mistakes that have been made that perhaps could have been avoided
Mhm.
if advice had been taken a little bit earlier, not
Yeah,
necessarily from a lawyer. There are lots of people that can help in the divorce space. But part of my role, I think, is to assist clients in navigating the process as easily and as amicably as possible.
yeah, absolutely. So actually talking about amicably, that takes us to, starting at the very, very early stages of the process. One of the things that I see often start things off in a very acrimonious and polarized way is when people request the divorce or announce their decision to divorce in the heat of an argument at a time where they haven't actually had time to think about how they're going to position this, how they're going to discuss the future with their spouse. Is that something that you've seen a lot as well?
Yes, and I think what's important for clients to understand is that very first conversation that perhaps takes a lot of strength and courage to initiate really does set the tone for what is
Does.
going to follow through the litigation. And so I always say to my clients, particularly those that come to me early, so
Yeah,
that we can think about that conversation, think about the content, think
yeah,
about when it might be delivered, that what you say is just as important as how you say it.
yeah.
And
And
so,
when and
yes,
where as
please,
well.
please avoid having
Yeah,
these conversations in the middle of an argument
yeah,
when your presentation with hindsight will not be as you would have hoped.
yeah,
And as I say, trying to manage the process as best as possible for you
yeah,
means that where you have control of those conversations and you are emotionally ready for them really does help and it will pay forward through the litigation.
yeah. Yeah, and I mean that conversation about wanting to move on, it's actually the first step towards that next chapter. And if you can make it as peaceful and considered and intentional as possible, then you have a much better chance of things going smoothly afterwards. And I think that's something, I mean, I made that mistake myself in my own divorce of, blurting it out in an argument. And it was very hard to backpedal from and to then reestablish a degree of trust and calm in the conversations. And I think the other thing that a lot of people don't realize, and I'm sure you've seen that a lot, is they they themselves as a decision maker may have been thinking about divorce for months, years sometimes, but the other person, even if they know there's issues in the marriage, may not be at all on that same page. And so I think a mistake that I see a lot of people make is they announce their decision to divorce and right away start negotiating the terms, where the other person is still barely coming up for
Yeah.
air and really struggling to catch up.
Yes, I think for the individual that is choosing the divorce, it is likely that they have spent quite considerable time
Yeah,
really reflecting on that decision. Particularly, I find where there are children,
of course. Yeah.
and the age of the children will impact on how that decision is formulated.
Yeah.
You have to be ready in that you have to have made that decision. And that emotional readiness doesn't immediately pass to the other
Yeah.
person with whom
Yeah.
you're having the discussion. They may well feel like they've just been hit by a double-decker bus.
Hmm.
And so, whilst the initiating party may well be ready and
Yeah.
want to turn to, is it a sole application? Is it a joint application? Let's talk about the money. Let's talk about child arrangements. That other person is standing there with a hurricane whirling around
Absolutely.
him. And there needs to be consideration on both sides
Yeah.
as to when is the right time to move forward.
Agreed. And actually, I think it's not even in their benefit, even for the person who wants to move ahead faster, it's not in their benefit to push the other person because then they're making ill-informed decisions, which they're likely to not want to stick to later on. And it's going to lead to just more back and forth, where if everyone's ready, emotionally ready, logistically ready, there it's going to be a much more constructive process.
I fully agree, and it can often mean that the party pushing forward perhaps feels at times impatient, or as though their views perhaps aren't being heard.
Yeah.
And I do understand that. But in terms of the process of the divorce and all that comes with that, actually taking a little bit of time at the beginning to prepare,
Yeah.
to curate the team around you that are going to support you through that process, that pace, that perhaps slower pace at that stage, really will pay off further
Yeah.
down the line.
And it's interesting. I've noticed that, with in other realms of life, people do their homework. When you apply for a
Mm.
job, before accepting an offer, you're going to research the company. You might speak to some of the people who work there. You're going to do some due diligence. Same with, buying a house or all sorts, even going on a trip. You're going to
Mm.
look into it.
Quite.
But with divorce, I think because it opens a phase that is the most uncomfortable for us as human beings, which is uncertainty, we tend to want to rush it and not to deal with the preparation that's required. Whereas actually, just like with everything else, taking time to prepare, to understand your options, to gather the information you need, that's what allows you to come into it really clear and really
Mm.
intentionally.
I fully agree. And they say, don't they, that the three most stressful things you can experience in life are getting married,
Yeah,
getting divorced, and moving
yeah,
house.
yeah,
You don't get married without a huge team around you. Similarly,
absolutely.
you don't move house without all the pieces of the jigsaw in place. And whilst you would see those two experiences as positive stress,
Yeah,
and I appreciate that a divorce is the opposite, and it comes with a lot of baggage and a lot of things to consider. It doesn't mean that you don't have that same team of experienced people around you.
agree.
And part of that planning period that you've referenced includes working out, well, who is my team?
Absolutely.
Who do I want around me? Who do I need around me? And that's going to be very unique to each client. And it's part of a divorce coach or a lawyer or a wealth manager, whoever might be that first point of contact for the client,
Yeah,
to really help them identify who do you need in your
yeah,
corner? Who do
yeah.
you need as your cheerleaders?
I agree. And it's not just what type of professional, it's which person within that profession as well, right? So it's not just getting a lawyer, is what kind of lawyer do you need for your case? And also at a human level, what kind of personality do you
Yes.
want that lawyer to have? How,
Yes.
do you want them to have the same kind of, I guess, values as you with regards to how you're going to proceed with the divorce? All of that is part of that preparation and making sure that you're getting advice from the right caliber of people and people that you feel you can trust.
Absolutely. And there are so many really good family lawyers.
Yeah.
Um, But we're not all right for every client.
Hmm.
I'm not going to be everybody's cup of tea. I have a certain style. It works for some. And when you generate work off recommendations, as I do,
Yeah.
it tends to be that personalities fit and it
Yes.
works.
Yeah.
But I won't be everybody's cup of tea. And
Yeah.
it's really important when clients are at that early stage of identifying who's going to be waving the flag for me, who's going to be
Yeah.
supporting me, that personality dynamic, it really does have to work. And I say that because as a lawyer, I receive very sensitive and at times emotionally charged information.
Yeah.
The trust that is created between a lawyer and their client, and indeed between a client and any professional that might be helping them through this process,
Yeah.
that
Absolutely.
trust is absolutely fundamental to the relationship. So you
Agree.
have to get on.
Yeah.
It's so important to like the lawyer that you're going to be working with.
If only because you're going to be spending a lot of time with them.
Yes, indeed.
But I think that's another mistake that I see people make is they will go with the first lawyer or the first coach or the first whatever they're introduced to. And first of all, it's not because somebody was the right lawyer or whatever, coach, financial advisor, whatever, for your friend, your cousin, or whoever recommended them, that they will be the right person for you. But also, it's worth speaking to at least two or three different people in each professional group before deciding which one is the right one for you. Because you need that comparison. It's like going back to buying a house. You're not going to buy the first one you visit. You're going to check out a few, and then you can compare them and contrast and make an informed decision. So again, back to our earlier point around not rushing things, taking the time to select the right person, even if it means, yes, you're going to have three meetings and repeat three times your story, which can be painful and time consuming. It's such an important decision in those early stages. It's really worth the
I
investment.
fully endorse that, yes. And I would say that doing the homework early on
Yeah,
to establish those people best placed to assist you, it will pay dividends.
yeah,
And I appreciate that repeating your story to multiple professionals in whatever capacity is difficult.
yeah,
In some ways, how the lawyer responds to that is a sign of how you will work together
that's true.
throughout the process. So perhaps see it as a learning and information gathering process as well.
Yeah, yeah, and then an investment for the future because if you change lawyers later on, it's disruptive. It's absolutely possible, but ideally, you want to be working with the right person from the start.
Oh yes, the continuity of your team is absolutely vital.
Great. So I want to move on to another point, which is one that I'm sure you see a lot in the context of international divorce, and we both work in that space. And there is a tendency to need to file quite fast to secure a
Mhm.
jurisdiction. And so one of the mistakes I see a lot of people make, and which is tricky in particular in that kind of context, is going ahead and filing without telling their spouse first. Now, there's safety concerns that sometimes absolutely justify doing that, and sometimes there's strategic concerns around jurisdiction. But I find it very difficult to backpedal from that when your spouse is effectively going to find out that you want a divorce from an email from the court rather than from you. It has a massive impact on trust. And do you want to share some of your experience around that?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, you helpfully identify that in some circumstances it is essential,
Yeah,
and swift filing is the only option.
yeah,
They are exceptional circumstances, though, and I would always be advising my clients that where we can adopt a more collaborative and transparent approach to the divorce and the
yeah,
timings of that divorce, again, it's all about establishing foundations for the bigger conversations that are going to come at a later date, whether
yeah,
that's in relation to the finances or the arrangements for children, if that's applicable.
yeah,
So I have always been of the thought that a courtesy email, whether that comes from the spouse directly or if they're represented from me or the other
Mhm.
lawyer, to make a polite introduction and to explain that the client has come to that decision carefully and
Yeah,
after much reflection, really just markers in the sand that signal, I'd like to do this sensibly, I'd like to
yeah.
do this amicably and together.
Yes,
Because
agreed.
that it's positive messaging to the other spouse, particularly if it's going to come as a shock or a surprise.
Absolutely.
But it's also about planning ahead for, as I say, the meatier stuff that we've got to
Yeah,
talk about and not wanting to upset the apple cart from day one because it's just
absolutely.
not necessary.
Yeah, and there'll probably be things later on that are worth actually arguing over, but it's about choosing your battles and
Absolutely.
yes, limiting the conflict. And I think that's one of the things that's very difficult. And another mistake that I see a lot of people make is they tend, there's a tendency in the upset of that moment of we're going to end this marriage to raise the temperature very high, either
Hmm.
by sending a very aggressive letter from a lawyer, for example, or by changing the locks on the other person, those kind of things. And the downside of that is, again, it's very hard to then rebuild that trust and to try and de-escalate the tension because right off the bat you've stabbed him in the back from the
Hmm.
other person's perspective. Is that something you've seen a lot of people do around, changing the locks is a typical one?
Yes, I think it depends when you first meet with your client. It depends where
Yes.
they've got to in their process
Yeah.
as to how much added value you can bring in terms
Yes.
of managing what will be helpful and
Mhm.
what won't be so helpful.
Yeah.
I always say to my clients, whether or not they're in a court process, before you hit send, please just imagine that a judge might need to read this
Yeah.
correspondence, whether that's correspondence about the relationship, about the finances, about the children. It doesn't matter if that correspondence is never going to see the light of day. That
Yeah.
should be your sense check.
Yeah.
Would it be okay, or am I going to wince just a little bit, or maybe even a lot, if a judge were to read this? So
Yeah.
that is for me a sort of a benchmark as to what's okay and perhaps what isn't okay.
Yeah.
And again, it plays into that bigger message of how do I want to handle this divorce?
Yeah.
Again, your example of changing the locks, with the caveat that in some cases it is absolutely essential
Mhm.
for safety.
Yeah.
Um, and of course, those decisions would be fully supported. In the majority of cases, it's just like lighting the touch paper.
It really is.
It's not going to help. And particularly if the property is jointly owned, you run the risk of a farce whereby you change the locks and then they might change them back. And that's not helping address the problem,
Absolutely.
or to really understand the dynamic in the family home and try to signpost and advise how it could be managed.
Yeah.
Because there are different ways of couples managing living under the same roof,
Yeah.
which for some is essential because their
Yeah.
finances don't allow them, whilst the divorce is ongoing, to live separately. There
Absolutely.
are ways of managing that and making sure that both parties are comfortable.
Absolutely.
Um, so changing the locks, I would always consider that very, very carefully. And if in doubt, please take advice.
Yeah. And I think, you touched upon something that's really important and that to me is really central to the work I do with my clients is their values. It's not just about what you can legally do. Maybe it's okay to change the locks from a legal perspective, but from a human perspective, think about the knock-on effects of that. Literally imagine the scene. Your spouse is going to come home, try and open that door and not
Mm.
be able to come in. Where are your kids going to be during that time? Are they going to see their father, their mother outside the door banging around and yelling? That whole scene needs to be experienced to even realize just how dramatic that could be. And then again, back to the, breaking the trust early on. how do you recover from that? How do you then say, I want us to do this amicably when you've literally just locked them out of their home? So I think it's always overlapping. Yes, you can or can't do that from a legal perspective, but also it's not because you can that you should. And I think that's maybe
Yes,
really missing there.
absolutely. And I think part of a lawyer's job within that framework is
Mhm.
to set out what the client's options are. Because,
Yeah,
yes, as an owner of the property, you are, of course, entitled to change the locks. But
yeah,
you hit the nail on the head, Chloe, when you say, but should you?
yes,
And part of a lawyer's role within the divorce or separation process is to ensure that decisions you make today
yeah,
don't have long-term ramifications further down the
absolutely.
line. And so, in some ways, it's about strategy, it's
Yeah,
about tactics. And I don't say that in a manipulative way. It's about case managing what is
yeah,
already a really difficult time for clients
yeah,
and trying to take where we can, just take the pressure off a bit.
yeah,
And where sensible decisions can be made, let's make them because they're
yeah,
easy wins.
absolutely. I agree. And I think that feeds into actually a greater point, which is understanding the process, understanding what likely outcomes you're looking at, and also the delays. A lot of people don't realize that there's waiting periods built into the process. It's gathering information is really what it boils down to, and information is power, and then it allows you to make these kind of decisions around the locks or anything else fully informed because you know what how it fits into the greater picture of what you're trying to achieve. And I think that's where it's essential for people to speak to a lawyer early on to understand, this is how much it's likely to cost, how long it's likely to take. Here are your options. If you went through a mediation approach, maybe it would be faster, and this is how you could potentially end up. Just getting that information so that you're entering the process with your eyes wide open effectively.
Absolutely. And I think the better informed a client is from the outset, not just from a lawyer, but from
Hmm.
other professionals that they may need to speak to,
Yeah,
the better informed they are, the better decisions they can make
yeah,
because they understand, okay, well, actually, for me, mediation might be a really great process. And these are three mediators that have been recommended to me. I'm going to
yeah,
chat it through with my spouse and let's make a joint decision. It
yeah,
might be for various reasons that we do need a court timetable in place. And
yeah,
so we talk about what will that look like? What's the time frame? And
yeah,
unfortunately, as you've alluded to with the court system as it is at the moment, um, court has to be considered very carefully because of the
hmm,
delays.
yeah,
There are private options available that can be discussed. And it's very much about understanding for that individual client what option is going to suit them best.
yes.
Whether that's because speed is a priority, is working collaboratively a priority. It's about curating a bespoke option that really works for that client.
I completely agree. And I think I wouldn't be doing this point justice if we didn't bring this up. Who do you get that information from is also very important. I mean, you and I, I'm sure, both had hundreds of experiences of people saying, ChatGPT told me this, or my friend, or some Facebook group I'm part of. Um, the quality, the reliability of that information is really, really important. And I think people tend, information's so available everywhere. They tend to think they're informed, but actually it's not a reliable source of information.
I totally agree. Where you get your information from is so important. And to anyone that's listening that is pondering it, thinking about it, or if it's just at the back of your mind,
Mhm.
please ensure that you speak with a lawyer because
Yeah,
it is a lawyer who is going to give you the hard and fast of what it actually means, of
yeah,
how the process works, the time frame of that process, what your options are, what it's going to cost. And I appreciate within that there are options available to you in terms of where the lawyer might be based and the type of firm they might work at. But they are the individuals best placed to navigate you through the
Yeah,
system, and to make sure that you understand where you stand.
that's right.
That's so, so important.
Yeah, and getting that, that reliable information. Because in a lot of cases, you don't know what you don't know, and I think that's the challenge. So, just yesterday, I had a client who said, "Oh, well, my friend said that I couldn't mediate with my ex because I can't stand to be in the same room as him." She had never heard about shuttle mediation. And so when I told her about it, she thought, oh, that would work. But no one mentioned because she hadn't asked a professional. It was this kind of hearsay, conversation over coffee. And that completely changed her thinking around how she might go about negotiating agreements with her ex. So, again, the devil is often in what you don't know. And that's where speaking to professionals rather than trying to look for information online can also be really helpful.
Yes, I fully agree, Chloe. And I think as well that no question is a silly question. I
Yeah.
sometimes have clients say to me in a first meeting where a lot of it is information gathering. It's
Hmm.
enabling me to paint a picture of what the family looks like.
Yeah.
How has the family operated? What roles have each party adopted during the marriage, for
Mhm.
example? No question is a silly question because I will be asking lots and lots of questions, as
Yeah.
any good lawyer will want to do. But crucially and really importantly, that lawyer is going to be listening
Yes.
and they're going to be absorbing everything that is being said. And if in the midst of that, the client thinks, I'm just not sure about that, or I don't understand, ask.
Yes.
Because
Brilliant.
it's the client's process after
Yeah.
all. You know, lawyers, divorce coaches, accountants, pension experts, we're all here to support the client,
Mhm.
but ultimately it is the client's process. So
Absolutely.
yes, I fully agree. You know, ask as many questions as you need to make sure you understand that when you say, right, green light, and this is what I want to do, that you've made the right choice for you.
Yeah, I agree. So we're talking about getting advice from friends and family, but I think another mistake that I see a lot of people do and make and it's a natural one is to try and seek alignment from their loved ones, but ending up putting especially their children, but even friends and family in the middle of it, or even asking them to take sides. How have you seen that impact people's experience of divorce?
I think more so when I advise in relation to child
Yeah,
arrangements, which of course is a hugely, hugely sensitive area. And it has to be handled very carefully because we have to distinguish between what is being said about a parent-child relationship by one parent or the other and the reality on the ground. We
yeah,
have to be so careful, whether there are private children arrangements being discussed or not. We have to be so careful about not putting the children in the middle.
yeah,
As lawyers, we keep our correspondence on matters of finance and matters of children entirely separate.
yeah,
So if I were to write to the other side, a money letter will only address matters of money
yeah.
and vice versa for the children because that presentation, it is hoped, then flows through
Mhm.
into the dialogue
Yeah,
between the parents
yeah,
or spouses. And I appreciate it's very easy for me to sit here and say that. But the hope is that if the client understands that that separation, the need for that separation, that that can have a positive impact at home and during the sort of broader discussions.
yeah, I agree. And I think it all ties into a sense that a lot of people have in divorce, when they feel wronged by the other person, this need for emotional justice, right? Of someone else recognizing and saying, yes, that was horrible what they did to you, or yes, I understand that you're angry or you're sad or whatever the feeling is. And that's when we tend to seek that from other people. Some people even expect it from the court process. And I think that's another misconception, that there's this idea that you're going to get your day in court where a judge is finally going to tell your ex all the horrible things they did, and that's going to have an impact and they're going to be punished by the law, which is kind of the ultimate
Mm.
sense of punishment for a lot of people. What is your sense around that expectation of emotional justice, and how people usually feel disappointed by that?
I think a fair amount of my job is about managing expectations,
Yeah,
whether that's in relation to outcome or how the process is going to serve the client.
yeah,
Um, you don't have your day in court.
no.
You might do in TV. You don't in real life. It just doesn't work like that. And actually, I would say even more so, please stay away from the court process.
Yeah,
There are so many other, we call it NCDR,
yeah,
non-court dispute resolution. There are so many other options available to parties to help them navigate through this difficult time. A judge is going to see but skimming the surface
yeah,
of what has happened in your marriage or in your relationship. What's more important is that you take ownership of your decisions about your life, your
yeah,
money, your children, and also to realize that your experience is completely unique.
yeah,
So asking friends, what did you get on the divorce? Did you get 60%? Did you get 50%? I confess my hackles always slightly go up when clients say to me, "Oh, but my friend got this." It doesn't matter,
yeah,
partly because as lawyers, we look at each client's circumstances
mhm,
completely uniquely. It's
yeah,
part of what we're required to do to act in the client's best interest, but also because that comparison just doesn't help.
right.
And it's not going to bring you any closer or any quicker to a conclusion.
Mm.
So I think my tip there would be people want to give advice, particularly if they've been
Yes.
through the process themselves. To the extent that you feel supported by it emotionally, then that's okay. But please don't rely on it in any
Yeah.
meaningful way, because it won't help you in your process.
I agree. And it leads to entrenched positions, which actually sometimes are not even valid. Well, they're valid on an emotional level, but not on a
Mm.
legal level. And it just makes it a lot harder, as you're saying, for then people to move away from those and reach agreements. And the one I typically see is, because the law refers to fairness in how assets are split, that is such a subjective concept. And, I have so many clients who say, oh, well, my mother was saying the other day, it's not fair that that X or Y happened, or that she or he isn't being punished for doing this or that. And that sense of unfairness, for a lot of people, it remains afterwards, just because their definition of fairness is different to how the court would define that.
Yes, and it is completely subjective. Judge A on a Monday may give a completely different opinion, viewpoint
Yeah,
on a particular issue to Judge B on a Tuesday.
yeah,
If you took a straw poll of 10 judges, you would have the various shades of grey, but
yeah,
it's highly unlikely that two judges are going to alight on exactly the same answer.
hmm,
Because as you say, Chloe, fairness is subjective.
yeah,
What somebody needs will be weighted differently by one judge or tribunal to another. And
yeah,
again, that's part of a lawyer's role in managing expectations, that there's no set outcome. There's no
yeah.
yes or no. It's all the shades of multicolour in the middle.
Yeah, and most cases are not very binary, so no one comes out winning and singing and dancing, and the other person comes down with their head bowed over. It's there's usually, I feel like in most successful divorces, certainly the ones that are negotiated, there's always going to be a certain sense of bitterness of "Oof, this isn't, you don't get everything you would want," because it's not about getting everything you want. It's about finding those areas of compromise.
Yeah, exactly. Compromise is
Yeah,
key. And also, I say to my clients, particularly where they've taken ownership of that decision and they have reached an outcome alongside the other party, whoever that
yeah,
may be, that actually, if you're both equally a little bit unhappy,
I agree.
that's probably quite a good outcome.
Yeah.
Because, particularly if we think about the finances, that income that was sustaining one household after the divorce has to sustain two households.
Absolutely.
Compromise, it's one of my favorite words. And it's absolutely essential in this
Yeah,
line of work.
Yeah, I think that's something that we see, a lot in movies and stuff is one party winning and another losing. And while, in criminal law and other areas of the law that might be the outcome of going to court, in family law, everybody loses a little bit because by definition, you're giving up some time with your kids, some of your money.
Mm,
And so having those expectations is going to be really key to knowing what you're doing and to making the right decisions.
absolutely.
Well, thank you so much, Kate. What I'm going to do is I will put your email address in the episode notes. So if anybody wants to reach out to you, ideally before anything's gone pear-shaped in those very early stages, that is definitely the time that I would recommend reaching out to Kate and or to myself. If you can anticipate as a listener out there, if you can anticipate and try and take the time to gather those ducks in a row, understand what it is that you're looking at in terms of a path forward. That's going to help everything be a lot smoother and less explosive. Avoid those kind of scenarios we see in Hollywood movies. Thank you so much, Kate. Thanks for joining me today.
It's been lovely chatting with you, Chloe. Thank you so much for having me.
Have a good day.